Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's live webcast. Anti-Bribery and Corruption Compliance, is Automation the Answer? And our speakers today, I'd like to introduce them. Great, thank you for turning that slide. Gavin Proudly, Global Director, Due Diligence at Dow Jones, has been helping clients manage financial crime, corruption, and reputational risk for over 10 years. He has delivered enhanced due diligence services to clients across a wide range of jurisdictions and sectors, including financial services, oil and gas, life sciences, and manufacturing. Gavin has supported clients involved in high-risk transactions providing anti-bribery due diligence, as well as helping others design and implement broader due diligence programs. He worked with large financial institutions, particularly with IPO and other investment banking teams, as well as supporting businesses in onboarding high-risk and high-value clients. Also, today we have with us Pat McParland. Pat joined Opus earlier this year as the head of global marketing for Opus. She has more than 20 years experience in financial services, leading marketing teams for Dun & Bradstreet and Dow Jones and other risk management companies. And with that, today I'm going to turn things over to Pat to begin our presentation.
Thank you very much, Sharon, and I'm really excited to be here today and excited to be here with you, Gavin. And before we get started with our main talk track about anti-bribery, anti-corruption, and automation, I wanted to say a word or two about the Opus mission and why we picked this particular topic. So just as a reminder, the mission of Opus is to free your business from the challenges and complexity of managing customer, supplier, and third-party risk. And a couple of keywords there are free your business. So Gavin's going to talk today about some of the challenges, but also the opportunities that are inherent in compliance and how using technology and understanding the trends can not help just free you from concerns about specific fines, but also help you position these as opportunities and look for better ways to improve efficiencies and effectiveness in your business, and ultimately compliance as a means to an end so you can focus on your priorities and better serve your customers and grow, innovate, and thrive. So kind of turning the idea of compliance as a must-do to an opportunity and an advantage. So I know that's something that you and I have chatted quite a bit about, Gavin, as a thread sort of underlying your talk track that tied back really well to the Opus mission. So we thought it would be great to start with this idea of, you know, how can compliance kind of free your business and what are some of the upsides and advantages as well as some of the challenges. So with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Gavin, and perhaps you can tell us what's happening in anti-bribery, anti-corruption. What are you seeing in the world of compliance from your perspective? And let's have a little bit of a chat.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Pat, for that introduction. I guess the first thing to say on what I'm seeing and what I've been observing really over the past 10 years is the increasing importance of the compliance function within organizations. So, you know, for all of the folk on the webinar, on the call, I think I have seen your jobs get more and more significant, more and more important, and I might even say more and more valued within your organizations. What does being important and valued mean? Well, it means you make the headlines of the Financial Times with this, the age of the compliance officer arrives. But it also means, and you all know this far better than I, that there is an increasing workload, increasing pressure, and increasing scrutiny. So we conducted a survey just earlier this year and asked a large number of compliance professionals about their work. And 59% said that their workload had increased over the past 12 months. 1% said it had decreased. So I want to find those businesses because they're obviously getting it right. So if you felt like you needed a holiday over this summer period, then I understand why. Your workload has been getting bigger. You also needed a holiday because, frankly, I don't think it's going to get any better. So the same respondents, 61% of them, so more than thought it had increased in the previous 12 months, 61% thought that it would increase further in the next 12 months. So workload getting heavier, the pressure increasing. What's driving that? Well, we asked them that question, and the vast majority said that what driving it was new legislation and new regulatory requirements. So I don't know how those on the phone feel, but it feels to me like we get a new regulation or a new piece of legislation almost every month. So last month we had new standard issued in China, in a particular part of China. Next month, on I think it's the 1st of September, the Bribery Act in Bermuda comes into effect. So two very, very different markets, two very different countries, and I might say different cultures, but both moving towards what is becoming an increasingly globally consistent standard around anti-bribery and anti-corruption requirements. So, you know, regulations are increasing. I mean, I'd only just got my head around the loi Sapin in France, and I'm sure there's many more to come. So regulation is increasing, but so too is enforcement. And I think, you know, what we see from enforcement across the world is that invariably big investigations are transnational. They involve multiple enforcement bodies, multiple countries, and touch multiple companies. I guess the bad news, if you needed any more, is I don't think it's going to get any easier. If I look at what's happening within anti-bribery regulation, it is getting more complex, and that's not to mention anti-money laundering and sanctions regulation as well. Sanctions, one of the things I've observed is governments putting increasing pressure and burden on companies to really investigate further their exposure to sanctions risk. It isn't any longer appropriate just to check whether or not someone is on a list or a company is on a list or not. What is expected now is that you need to know whether or not that company you are doing business with is associated with, is controlled by someone on a list. And that requires research. So sanctions regimes are now increasingly putting the burden on businesses to understand the impact of them on their companies. Also, just in terms of where companies are looking for growth, there is still a tendency to seek opportunities for growth in what can be considered as high-risk markets. So Iran is a great example of that, where obviously when the agreement was reached, well over a year ago now, there was a huge flurry of activity because Iran is a fantastic market, really highly educated workforce, very well-developed market, actually very broad markets, not just oil and gas. But even without the issue of sanctions, which remains highly complex, but even without that issue of sanctions, Iran is a very high-risk market with a very high perceived level of corruption, where your likelihood of engaging with politically exposed persons, for example, is very high. So these markets represent great opportunities, but they are high risk. Lastly, one of the reasons I also think life isn't getting easier for compliance professionals is an increasingly long list of issues is coming under their remit. Issues that are in some ways reputational risks rather than regulatory risks. And new legislation like modern slavery, conflict minerals obviously is one, but and tax transparency. But actually the power of the consumer to drive the debate is meaning that organizations need to have an eye on a whole range of reputational issues that could come back to bite them. And those issues can bite them just as hard as some regulatory issues. So, sorry, I think I was about to interrupt you, Pat.
Oh, no, not at all. I was just thinking to myself that you outlined a number of different challenges. You know, the increasing workload, the new legislations coming up every day. You know, the high-risk world. You know, enforcement's increasing and reputation, not just regulation. So you're painting a bit of a complex picture, and you know, I see where you're heading next in due diligence, and I'm just wondering how, you know, the folks on the audience kind of cope or deal with this increasingly complex environment.
Yeah. So you know, I struggle sometimes, because sometimes I really think it's pretty easy, and all you need to know is you need to know that you're doing business with people that don't expose you to unknown risks that you can't manage. And when I say people you're doing business with, I mean across your whole value chain, from the very initiation of that idea through to the creation of the product and how that gets to market. So all along that value chain, if you're asking the questions about risk, you're going to get it right. And that's why, for me, you know, due diligence really is at the heart of a effective compliance program. So if you're asking, is this individual or entity associated with a PEP? If you're asking about whether or not there are any contact with state-owned entities, if you're asking about bribery risk, if you understand the ownership structure of these business partners, if you've thought about whether adverse media is associated with them that might affect you, if you're asking those questions at the right time, you're often going to reach good decisions. One thing I would say is that, you know, bribery continues to occur predominantly through third parties. So it might not be, and in fact it is likely not to be, your employees who are acting directly unethically. It's much more likely to be a third party doing that purportedly on your behalf. The problem is that third parties are a critical aspect of most organizations' values chains. You can't have a global organization or even a local organization without having a lot of business relationships. And increasingly, those value chains are very, very long indeed and cover multiple jurisdictions. So third parties are where bribery more often happens. Third parties are critical. I guess for me, the point of due diligence, and this comes back to your earlier point, Pat, about, you know, freeing you up to do business. Due diligence should be a process that people in your organization see as helping you grow. And what it's doing is preventing you growing your risk as you pursue those opportunities.
Yeah, it's interesting. When you're talking about the bribery continues to occur through third parties, something else that we've been hearing frequently is also that the cybersecurity risk and the data breaches happening there as well. So interesting. So,
yeah.
So about the due diligence, so what advice do you have for making this easier for companies who are engaged in this? And, you know, it'd be interesting to hear you talk about, you know, identifying who the third parties are, and that seems at the heart of that as well.
Yeah, so I think the well, let's start with the what people have told us, and then I'll come on to where I think how I think effective programs can be brought into place. So a really interesting fact that came out of our survey was that confidence in the due diligence process appeared to be dropping amongst our respondents. So previously, 63% of respondents were happy, were confident in the information they were receiving through due diligence. That dropped this year to 49%. So less than half of our respondents had confidence in the information and the process around due diligence. And I kind of asked myself why, because as due diligence has matured as a process, I would have thought people's confidence in it would increase. But I think what has actually happened is, as due diligence has matured as a process, compliance officers have actually started to think about the steps involved more carefully and realize that actually there are some aspects of it that are harder than they previously thought. So, for example, 56% said, yeah, there is difficulty in evaluating the credibility of the information. They found difficulty in accessing the right information. They found they had insufficient staff, uncertain about where to get information. They didn't have the budget. That's a message we all hear all the time. Time pressure, again, a similar message. And language barriers. So, you know, interestingly, a fifth of our respondents felt that they just didn't have the languages to be able to do the right type of due diligence in the right jurisdiction. So due diligence is maturing as a process, but organizations are realizing that actually there's quite a long way to go to really get it right. So if we think of all of those points, actually there are lots of ways in which organizations can take steps to improve their effectiveness, and often that is through technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the key topics of our talk today is automation technology. How can that help in the due diligence and compliance process? What are some of the upsides and potential pitfalls of that? And it strikes me as I'm looking at this while you're talking is, you know, how much the data plays a piece in that as well, you know, with the credibility of the information, accessing the information, where to get the right information, and how important and essential the data is, you know, tied into the technology. So it'd be interesting when you talk about the automation to hear, you know, kind of the combination of the data and the technology together. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the role of technology and automation in the compliance process.
Yeah, well, so Pat, you must remind me if we reach the end of this webinar and I haven't used the phrase fake news. You must remind me because we need to use that phrase. Okay, well, you just did,
so you can use it again. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I want to talk about that at some point. But let's just talk about this image that we've got on the screen here briefly. This does not represent a ideal due diligence process or a you know, what I would believe to be the perfect process. It's a picture that I hope reflects what for most people are the big building blocks of a due diligence process. So your organizations identify a third party. You'll probably have some way of assessing risk in that third party. You'll conduct some due diligence. There'll be escalations if there are issues. There'll be approvals. And then you'll review and refresh the due diligence because everyone tells you from Bermuda to Shanghai that due diligence is not a point-in-time process, but is something that is an ongoing process. So those are the big building blocks. Now, for me, you know, technology helps you do 4 things across this process. 4 things that are essential within the process. So that is, it helps you be comprehensive. If you've got a due diligence process that is not comprehensive, you're going to really struggle, especially if you come up in front of a regulator. Because if you can't demonstrate that it's comprehensive, then how are you going to stop that that bit of the business that's operating close to the risk appetite, who wants to make that deal, engaging with a third party that they know to be engaged in unethical practices? So it needs to be comprehensive. It needs to be consistent. Most of you on the phone will work for organizations that have multiple divisions, maybe across different jurisdictions, and I'm sure you'll all be the first to agree that across large organizations there are often quite different cultures and quite different approaches to processes, and you need your due diligence process to be consistent. You need it to be efficient. If it isn't efficient, someone in sales, someone in the business unit is going to get really frustrated and they're just going to bypass the system. So it needs to be quick. Lastly, it needs to be auditable. Your ability to demonstrate to external stakeholders and to internal stakeholders that you've taken the right steps at the right time in the right way, you can only do that if you've got an auditable process. And technology, I think, helps you with all of these aspects. So starting with the comprehensive, if you look at these steps, there's an awful lot to get your arms around. And Pat, you asked earlier about what types of third parties. If you can, it is fantastic to have a platform through which you can observe the totality of your risk. I remember talking to a head of compliance at a mining firm, and big mining firm, and he said, I worry, Gavin, that probably out of a third of relationships that we have don't get anywhere near me. I don't have any sight of them. And this was a listed organization, and it is very common for compliance teams to feel that people across the business are cutting deals, establishing relationships that are not going through the appropriate due diligence. It's very common. Technology is going to help you get to a point where you feel more confident about your comprehensiveness. Consistent, I want to dwell on this a little bit because, I talked earlier about culture, and a way of driving consistency is to make computers do stuff. I think the most important area for this is in that risk scoring part. So how do you make sure that a third party is considered in the same way, using the same criteria, adopting the same approach in Brazil and Bratislava, somewhere else beginning with B? So how do you do that? You get a technology to do it for you. One point on that, though, is the data going into it needs to be good. So to get a really effective, consistent risk scoring through technology, you need a good data input. So what a lot of people have is questionnaires that might be completed internally or by the third party that capture some of that data. So consistency, technology can really drive that. And I would say the most important part where they do that is around the risk scoring. Efficient, well, Pat, you asked about sort of where you get the data and so on, and I think this is a really interesting area because the technology is great if you've got great data behind it. Where it's really effective is where that data is highly structured. So you can do that with screening because you can create structured data. For example, sanctions lists, and other compliance databases. You can create that structured data that can be screened against in a very highly automated way. And that's where automation is, it's absolutely, this has to be the approach that people take. But that automation won't necessarily always pick up on the nuances. And you and I talked a while ago about a particular example of something that was in the news recently, I'm not suggesting there is. I'm not making a claim to the rights or wrongs of the case. I don't know all the facts of the case, but reported in the paper was an individual who was called Uzi Katz, and Uzi Katz was spelt O-O-Z-I for Uzi and C-A-T-S as in the pet for cats. And he was a CEO of an Italian and a UK listed company. And interestingly, there was another person called Uzi Katz, spelled U-Z-I-K-A-T-Z, who had been charged with fraud in the early 1990s in the US. And I guess the point I want to make is using technology and using automation can be really quick and effective, but it can also miss stuff. It might miss, for example, a different anglicization of a Hebrew name, unless you tell the algorithm that that's exactly what you want to do. And here we come to a fifth part of what technology should, or I guess a fifth aspect of your due diligence program, which is it needs to be cost effective. So it needs to be comprehensive, consistent, efficient, auditable. Technology can help you with all of that, but it also needs to be cost effective. And so to create technology that can mimic the effectiveness of a human analyst in some due diligence procedures, I'm not sure we're there yet with cost effectiveness. So I think technology is great, but there's still aspects of due diligence which are very human.
Interesting. So you mentioned a lot of different keywords. I heard you say holistic, auditable, efficient, comprehensive, and I don't think you said exactly these words, but it sounded like you were describing a risk-based approach to segmenting the whole group of third parties and other constituents that you're looking at. And you mentioned the person who said they only understood a third of the third parties that they had relationships with, and sounds like one of the things that the technology does well is kind of get you to across that first line of you can do the risk scoring and the risk-based segmentation, but that the human intelligence or the human insight is what's the next step of, you know, what do these things really mean? That's what I heard you say there. So I'm interested in the word culture, that you mentioned that a couple of times too, because there was sort of a global theme in what you mentioned in your early remarks about all the global regulations and, you know, the whole fact of this field being so global. But you mentioned the culture in terms of enterprise also, and that's very interesting in that it feels like the role of the compliance professional is becoming so much broader as a key player within the enterprise. One of the things that we hear a lot here is this phrase, compliance is a team sport. You know, the chief compliance officer working with the chief technology officer around the automation here and working with other parts of the organization. And I'm just curious if you're seeing that as well. You know, how that kind of fits in with the, you know, the automation. You see this as sort of an enterprise-wide thing? Is it a compliance-only thing? So I think I'm asking you kind of a multi-part question there.
Yeah.
Is the role of the compliance person expanding, and how does this kind of fit in the enterprise scenario?
It's a great question, and I like that. Compliance is a team sport. I'm going to use that. I think, interestingly, it's an Olympics team, though. It's because it's lots of different sports.
Good one.
I'm seeing, you know, you mentioned cybersecurity. So at the moment, you know, typically an individual with responsibility for anti-bribery procedures in an organization will not also be responsible for information security, because information security has typically been about building big walls around your business so that the data can't get out to anyone bad. Well, actually, we now know that the route in is often through third parties. So what we're seeing is anti-bribery professionals are probably those that are well placed to understand the risks associated with third parties, and are now their experience is being drawn on by information security professionals in tracking the cyber threat. They're also increasingly looking at contract management as being an area where, well, hang on, if we're looking at renewing our due diligence on this third party, focus on bribery and corruption issues, are we also focused on the commercial aspects of this third party? So the strength of a really effective third-party risk process is that you have a framework through which you can have really effective commercial conversations and really effective conversations across a range of risks that your business faces. And I mentioned sort of reputational risks as well as regulatory risks. Your PR team, your head of communications will be the first person to worry about a cyber breach. They're the people that are going to be talking to the chairman of the board, explaining what do we say to our consumers and our shareholders and the public about this issue. So, your PR team is also getting involved. So there's a whole range of stakeholders that I think are now increasingly collaborating more. I guess the challenge is still that those stakeholders sometimes have quite different interests. And, there are still people within the organization that want to drive growth, and that is the thing that is really at the heart of their reason for establishing a relationship, and they want that relationship to be established quickly, and they are concerned about the bottom line rather than the risk. And others are concerned more about the risk and therefore want to establish the relationship at a pace that is appropriate. So there is still challenges, and it's still, it's not plain sailing by any means, but I do see people collaborating more.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like the tension of the risk and the growth, like the measured risk. Interesting. So what about, you alluded to this, well, and actually before I ask the question, I want to let the audience know that if you have questions, feel free to ask the questions using the chat tool on GoToMeeting, as Sharon mentioned in the beginning. We will open it up for broad questions and shortly here, and we welcome any questions that you have. So I had a question about artificial intelligence and machine learning. I heard you say something
Yep.
like, we're not quite there yet. That was
Yep.
the words I heard you say. And I was curious what sort of role that kind of technology plays in the kind of the picture that you're painting here.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm pausing because I'm in that age bracket of people that really is being left behind by talk of artificial intelligence, and it scares me. But it fascinates me as well. I think that in 5 years' time, aspects of the work that we currently deliver to clients will be entirely automated, and it will be automated using machine learning to some extent. Artificial intelligence, I think, is going to be a key driver of efficiency in the future for a couple of reasons. One, information is becoming increasingly available. So, I'm saying 10 years, but it's more than 10 years ago when I first started in this business. There wasn't the availability of data across the globe that there now is. The ability of the folk on the phone, to obtain information about a company in far-flung parts of the world has changed fundamentally over the course of the past decade, and that acceleration is exponential. We're not there yet, though, and so information is becoming increasingly available, but at the moment there are two blockages. One, it's not consistently available. If you want to find out about the ultimate beneficial owner of a company in Kenya or in Nigeria, and you want the most recent and the most authoritative information, i.e. information from a government registry, then you need to physically turn up and find that information. Now, you can use a database that may have historic information or may have surfaced that information previously, but it's not going to be considered to be have the recency and reliability of going direct to the source. So that's the first point. Information is not consistently available, and that causes you a problem. The second point is information is still, whilst becoming increasingly available, is not yet sufficiently governed and controlled that you can make real sense out of it without creating a whole lot of noise. So if I throw my crawlers out to gather all of the data about Gavin Proudly, a lot of what I get back will be rubbish and not relevant. You'll get lots of marathon times that are just not relevant to what you need. Now, artificial intelligence can help you over time, but the cost of doing that at this point doesn't match, in my experience, and I'm sure there's some organizations that do feel it matches it, but in my experience, for most organizations, the cost of programming that kind of technology doesn't match the budget that they've got, or indeed the risk that they're facing. So at the moment, we're not there. In time, two things are going to happen. The technology will become cheaper. That's just the way it goes, and that will happen. And so it become more cost-effective to use that technology. And secondly, what I foresee is that a huge volume of data will have resulted in actually some other enterprises getting governance around that data and creating structured data lists, structured data that can be more easily interrogated. So AI is definitely going to have an impact. At the moment, within the corporate world in particular, I'd caveat that for financial services, where I think it has a probably greater role to play. But in the corporate space, I don't see it yet playing the role that it will do in the future.
Sounds good. So maybe something intriguing that time has not yet come. So I'm going to go back to one of my favorite themes, Gavin, which is data and information. So that came up in your survey results, and thinking about technology, you and I have talked about this before. It's almost like technology is like the pipes, and without the data is like the water. I mean, it's not going to, the machine's not going to run without the information. And so, interested in hearing your thoughts about, for the audience, about kind of managing all this third-party data. How do people identify the third parties, get a grasp on all the vast amounts of information out there? You mentioned structured data. I'm also curious about the unstructured data and vast amounts of things out there. So it's really a large essay question about the role of data in the picture here, because this is really the technology side. What's your viewpoint on the data piece?
So I think I mentioned earlier, I think the technology works really well if the data that's behind it is good, and we all have experience in our day-to-day work of tools that we have on our desktops that we don't use because we know that we're just going to get rubbish out of them when we type in the search term. So let me think about this process, identification and of the third party. The first step on a due diligence process for many organizations is somehow capturing the need for a relationship. If you've got the right platform in place with the right technology, then actually the first step is check that I don't already have the relationship that I think I need. One of the things that we find when we work with clients that are reviewing or implementing a sort of more structured approach to their third-party risk management is they realize how much duplication they've got in different jurisdictions, how they've got different bits of the business with a relationship with the same entity and neither bit of the business new. So step one, ask yourself the question, does someone else in my business already have this relationship? If not, I need to be logging this. And when you're logging this, from a compliance perspective, this is a critical point to capture the most relevant, significant data as quickly as possible, such that you know the business user is going to complete, if you like, the survey, complete the form in an effective way. So if you make this form too long, they ain't going to do it. If you make it too complicated, you're going to get different answers, and it will be impossible to interpret. For me, this starting step is so important. Who's the entity? What are they doing? Why were they chosen? What are they going to deliver to us? A few very basic questions, but really important questions that help you start to understand the risk. So that's
basic but essential, right? I mean, if you don't start with who are you doing business with, or whom, to be grammatically correct, then where are you going to start? So, and it strikes me, sometimes we get the question, in fact, I think we got it today, should I invest in technology or data? And it's not an either or, it's kind of a both. And there's a data aspect to the technology of, which we didn't talk about much here today, which is the kind of like cleansing, matching, identification in your Uzi Cats example, not just different entities, but entities that appear to be the same entity, or different entities are actually the same one, like rampant duplication across the different systems and that aspect of things as well. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So why capturing that information is critical is, in a couple of steps time in the due diligence process, you're going to go on and screen that entity, and you need to know damn sure that you have screened the right entity, or that you're not screening an entity that's going to get you a gazillion false positives because you've just used too loose a term or too loose a name. So really important all the way through. That first point, capturing the data, works all the way through. In terms of the data sources, I think that if you can afford to invest in structured data, including news databases and so on, that is going to stand you in very good stead, rather than relying on other search engines are available, but the phrase is doing a Google search. I still see across an awful lot of organizations, well, we do a bit of Googling, and that's great and that's fine, and of course you wouldn't want to not do that, but everyone needs to be clear with themselves that Google is a very, very complex tool that is to some extent designed to deliver to you what you want to see. So if I were to Google the name of your company, Pat, it might show me something about an Opus that builds sheds, because it knows I'm really interested in buying a new shed for my garden. So the point is, Google shows you what it thinks you want to see rather than what you've asked to see.
Well, sure, and Google learns from what you do. So so Google learns that I search for Opus all the time and risk management, so it points me in those directions. So I understand what you're saying. So I want to remind the audience, if you would like to ask a question, to use the question function on your GoToWebinar tool. And Sharon, I want to go to you and see if we have any questions from the audience, since I've been asking lots and lots of questions. I would like to see if the audience has any questions for Gavin.
Sure, we do have a couple questions that came in. First, do you see compliance professionals interacting more broadly across the enterprise? Are they getting a bigger seat at the table, for example, with IT? And who is responsible for the automation there?
Oh, that's a great question. So I can't tell that individual person who's responsible in their organization, but we all have experience of technology that has been brought to bear, and I've seen it in the due diligence space, where technology is designed by teams with a focus on the functionality of the technology rather than a real focus on the importance of the process. So that technology has to be really user-driven, and I can't emphasize that enough. If you create a tool that is not able to be used by users on the front line, it's just going to lie redundant, and I've seen that too many times. So really important that not just the compliance teams, but other stakeholders, sales, I would say, sales and marketing, and other business users are really involved in the design of the requirements. Are compliance professionals getting a seat at the table? In large organizations they are. I still don't see enough significance placed on that role at a board level. There are individuals on the board that have responsibilities, but it's still typically combined with a range of other functions. But yeah, and I think one of the reasons for that is the increasing accountability, personal accountability of individual executives in relation to bribery and corruption legislation. So, you know, executives are going to jail for bribery and corruption. So when that starts to happen, then executive management thinks, well, we need someone at a very senior level to be taking responsibility for this, because I don't want my head on the line every time. So, you know, partly it's the regulatory environment that's driving that. But, you know, I come back to what I was saying right at the top of the webinar. Compliance has become a much more important function within an organization. Partly it's driven by regulations, but partly it's also driven by an understanding by businesses that they need to demonstrate to their customers and to the market that they're taking ethical business seriously.
Great. We're starting to get rolling in with a lot of questions, so here we go. You mentioned a compliance program should be comprehensive and efficient, and Pat suggested having a risk-based program can help with that. Do you have any additional comments or recommendations about how to allocate resources to the right levels? For example, would you recommend the 80-20 rule, 80% of the time resources spent on the high-risk partners?
So I had a slide that I've been using, which sort of has about 75% of your third parties are probably going to be lower risk. What you've got to look to achieve is the quickest route from start to finish for a low risk entity. The higher risk relationships are going to very quickly come down to a commercial decision. What's the value, the financial value of this relationship? Because it's going to take time to onboard this third party. So is it worth it? I think that, you know, the focus actually is on making the low risk relationships really quick and efficient and getting those through a process. And that process can be quite light. If you achieve that, then you really are a long way there. In terms of spending your resources, you know, what you want to avoid is spending a lot of time on effort on relationships that are not worth it to the business. And that's so I think always pushing back on the business unit, and maybe even a charging structure. Some people that I've seen employ this, a charging structure where you say, look, this is going to take some time and money. Are you as the business willing to commit the X amount of money to this due diligence process? And that quite quickly gets them to think, oh, do you know what, we'll just go with the other sales agent that we've already got on the books.
Okay. Our next question, what would be the internal audit role in that aspect of due diligence?
Oh, great question. I think it's really important. I would ask all compliance officers to have a meeting with their head of internal audit or maybe they might, sometimes their roles cross over, but head of internal audit and say, what are we doing in the next financial year to make sure third-party risk is absolutely embedded in our internal audit program? Which jurisdictions do we consider to be high risk? Therefore, which relationships are we going to be subject to transaction monitoring and so on? So internal audit, really important role to testing whether or not that due diligence process has been followed effectively.
Okay. When automating, what are the failure points that you have seen over the years?
So is that failure points?
Yes.
Yeah. I think it's this consistency piece, consistent availability of data. So tools are created that are appropriate for certain jurisdictions, but actually don't work globally. So, you know, in the UK, here in sunny London, I say sunny London, there's a lot of clouds as well, but in sunny London, you know, I can have an automated tool that will automatically draw for me the directors and owners of a business. But that technology doesn't work globally. You know, that doesn't happen in Delaware in the US. So the risk of automation is that you create something that's good in a select number of markets, but as you grow as a business, you realize, oh, we've got to find a workaround, and so you end up with lots of workarounds.
In trying to make the case for an automated process, do you see, sorry, I'm trying to read this. Do you see statistics on the increased throughput of assessments?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be the real KPI, and what we would hope to see as tools that you know drive automation improve, we would see an increased throughput and a reduced cost compared to the equivalent throughput and cost of human research. Now, interestingly, when you look at the financial services sector, when large organizations, banks are going through big remediation projects for their KYC files, you know, a very similar process to the anti-bribery due diligence for third parties often, they're still using big teams of people. Now, we're working, you know, we work with a number of organizations that are focused on automating this research, and we're getting there. But that will be that's the key metric people should look to. Is this going to be quicker than having people do it? And is it going to cost me less than having people do it? At the moment, often the answers to both those questions are no.
Okay, I have one final question. I agree that AI might be a few years away to be cost efficient for organizations, but how data mining could be used effectively today could data mining be used effectively today to be more efficient with compliance initiatives?
So I think the data mining is very, very important and helpful to compliance teams in an investigative context. The data mining, if we're talking about big data and, you know, accessing data from across the globe rather than from defined sources, that data mining in a compliance context can provide just too much noise. So important to use it in the right way at the right time when it's really essential. The other point I would make about data mining, and I realize we're running close to time, but we haven't talked about data protection, data privacy. You know, within the EU, obviously, we have new regulations coming into play. Across the world, data privacy is becoming a much more important aspect of our work that will impact how we collect, process, and retain data on individuals. And so that data mining can be seen as quite intrusive and can be seen as not appropriate to the requirement.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a great topic there, Gavin. Sounds like a whole nother conversation around data protection, data privacy. You know, maybe we want to get together again and talk about GDPR and things like that. So I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. I heard a lot of great things that you shared with us around how automation and technology can make compliance more effective, more efficient, can help you. You know, you talked about the risk-based scoring, and you know, talked about the percentages there, and how, you know, technology can actually get you part of the way that you do the segmentation for you, and not that you do no due diligence across the board. You just assess the levels of due diligence, and the technology can help you with that. Yet, to your point, the kind of human insight of the, you know, the compliance professional folks on the phone, that's, you know, where the insight comes in, and the, you know, kind of assessing the due diligence. So that was the words I had when you were talking the whole time are art plus science. I mean, that's what I came away with is, you know, it just makes you more efficient, and then you need the intelligence and insight to kind of take it to the next level and make compliance an advantage so you can grow. So thank you very much. I want to thank everybody on the phone. Just let you know a couple of things that are coming. We did briefly mention cyber risk is something we hear a lot about. We are coming out with a research study about cyber and information security risk in third parties, and that's going to be published in just a couple of weeks. And you can find this information, the webinar replay, all the information up on the Opus website, as well as our blog, where we talk about regulations. In fact, you briefly touched on Shenzhen. There's a new blog up there about the Shenzhen standard. Talks about that in more detail. And if you would like, follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we post things daily, and always looking for feedback from you. If these sessions are effective, what else we could cover. And I'm going to turn it over to Sharon so she can let you know how to find the information and give us feedback. So thanks, Sharon.
Great, thank you. This does conclude our webinar for today, and if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out using the contact information or shown at the screen at marketing@opus.com, or you can always log on to www.opus.com and send questions through the Contact Us form. The slides and the recorded webcast will be uploaded and on our website at the beginning of next week and available for replay. We do appreciate your participation, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.